My father threw me out of the house in the rain for choosing college. Today I own his factory. My name is Michael Carter. I'm 48 years old, and today I own everything my father swore I would never have. The last time I looked him in the face, he shouted that without his last name and without his metal factory, I was nothing more than a parasite carrying books under my arm. He threw an old suitcase at my feet and slammed the door in my face while the rain hammered against the roof of the family warehouse. That day, my own father erased me from his life for the simple sin of wanting to design engines instead of inheriting his debts and his violent temper. But what he didn't know, while he watched me walking through the mud, was that the intelligence he despised so much would be the very tool I would use to dismantle his empire piece by piece, 20 years later. There is nothing more dangerous than a man who learned to build his own path while the people who were supposed to love him waited to see him fall to his knees. He thought he was taking my future away, but he was only giving me the perfect reason to destroy him with the precision of a surgeon. Blood makes you relatives, but loyalty makes you family, and my father broke that bond out of pure blind pride. Now he is sitting in an office that no longer belongs to him, waiting for a miracle that carries my signature at the bottom. If you like stories where betrayal has consequences and justice arrives without warning, leave your like and subscribe. Here we share real stories of revenge and lessons that are never forgotten. My father's metal factory wasn't a business, it was a religion. For him, the noise of hydraulic presses and the smell of burnt oil were the only things that gave a man value. I grew up watching his silhouette cut against the sparks of welding, always with a frown, always with that belief that physical effort was the only real currency. My father, a broad-shouldered man with calloused hands, believed destiny was written in iron. To him, I was simply the heir to a foreman's position, the one responsible for continuing a tradition of sweat and obedience that came from his own father. But I never fit that mold. While he wanted me to learn how to operate the lathe, I spent my nights analyzing engineering and thermodynamics diagrams. My refuge was not the workshop, but a small room filled with calculus books that he considered a complete waste of time. The balance at home was fragile, held together by a tense silence that broke every time school grades arrived. He never celebrated my perfect scores. He looked at them with suspicion, as if every high mark were a betrayal of his worker's legacy. My mother, a woman who had learned to make herself invisible to avoid my father's storms, slipped books to me in secret, but never dared to defend my right to choose. Our family's status in the community was solid. We owned the oldest metal parts supplier in the area. We weren't rich, but we had that stale respect that comes from having employees under you and buying a new pickup truck every 2 years. My father walked through the factory like an absolute king, and he expected me to be his crown prince, someone who shouted as loudly as he did and despised knowledge just as much as he did. I remember the dining room table perfectly, a massive piece of solid wood where the air always felt heavy. My father used to say that men of our blood didn't need paper degrees to command, that leadership was earned through strength and presence. I listened while my hands, clean and without cuts, gripped the utensils with a contained anger he mistook for submission. He believed my silence meant acceptance, but in reality, it was observation. I was studying his mistakes long before I understood what business strategy even was. I watched how he treated suppliers with arrogance, how he neglected to modernize the machinery, and how he blindly trusted contracts that existed only because of old friendships. His empire had cracks, deep cracks that his pride refused to see, but my eyes, trained by logic, could detect them from miles away. He wanted a mirror, but I was a piece of glass reflecting a reality he hated. To my father, university was a place for men who were afraid to get their hands dirty. In his mind, leaving to study mechanical engineering was a declaration of war, a way of telling him that his life wasn't enough for me. And in part he was right. His life of bitterness and roughness wasn't enough, I wanted to create, not just maintain. I wanted to optimize, not just repeat. The conflict escalated every time I mentioned scholarships or academic programs. He would simply slam his hand on the table and say the factory was my university and that the hammer was my diploma. Back then I was 18 years old and had a determination he completely underestimated. He believed my financial dependence was his leash, that as long as he paid for the roof and the food, I would remain his shadow in the workshop. But I had already started saving every coin I earned, doing maintenance jobs on the side. I was building a lifeboat, while he believed I was drowning in his ocean of grease and iron. Emotionally, my status was that of a prisoner waiting for the guard to slip. I knew the confrontation was inevitable, but I also knew that once I took that step, there would be no turning back. I wasn't looking for his approval. I was looking for my freedom. The atmosphere in the factory became unbearable in the months leading up to the final decision. He assigned me the dirtiest and most exhausting tasks, trying to break my schoolboy will, as he liked to say. He forced me to stay until dawn cleaning oil filters while my high school classmates prepared for college entrance exams. He watched me with a satisfied smile every time he saw me exhausted, believing the fatigue would make me reconsider. But every drop of sweat only reinforced my desire to leave. Every insult about my paper intelligence became another brick in the wall separating us. I was the owner's son, yet he treated me worse than the newest apprentice, just to prove that outside his rules I was worth nothing. That was the world he understood, power through humiliation. And I, in absolute silence, swore that one day I would return every ounce of that contempt, not with shouting, but with results he would never be able to achieve. Everything exploded on a Tuesday afternoon, under a grey sky that threatened a storm that ended up being more than meteorological. I had received the acceptance letter from the engineering school with a partial scholarship that covered a large part of my studies. I walked into his office, that space saturated with cigarette smoke and stacked invoices, with the envelope in my hand. There was no joy on my face, only an icy determination. When I placed the paper on his metal desk, he didn't even read it completely. His eyes jumped straight to the university logo and then to my face. At first there were no shouts, only a heavy silence, the kind of calm that comes before an earthquake. He put his cigarette in the ashtray, leaned back in his old chair that creaked under his weight, and let out a dry laugh that carried no trace of humor. He looked me up and down, as if I were a defective product that had just come off his production line. His words were slow, filled with a poison meant to paralyze me. He said I was nothing more than a traitor, a coward who preferred to hide in a classroom rather than face the reality of hard work. He called me ungrateful, claiming that every plate of food placed on my table carried the sweat of the factory I now despised. I didn't move. I kept my back straight and my hands steady at my sides. My silence seemed to enrage him more than any answer I could have given. He expected me to beg, to cry, or to apologize for having ambitions of my own. But my gaze stayed locked on his, studying how the veins in his neck swelled with anger. Then came the public humiliation. He stood up, slammed his office door open, and walked into the machine area shouting for all the workers to stop. The noise of the presses died instantly, leaving behind a deafening void. In front of men who had watched me grow up, men who respected me more than he did, he pointed at me with an accusing finger. He said out loud that his son was a little gentleman who thought he was too good to get his hands dirty alongside them. He called me a parasite. He said he would rather have any apprentice from the assembly line as a son than a paper engineer. Heat rose to my cheeks, but my expression remained unmoved. I felt the pity in the eyes of some of the workers, and that hurt more than his insults. It was the ultimate betrayal. My own father trying to destroy me in front of the very community he had built. We returned to the office and he gave me the ultimatum. If I walked out that door to attend college, I would lose not only my job and my inheritance, but my last name. He told me that if I left, I would leave without a single dollar, without support, and without a home. He thought I would break. He thought the fear of poverty would make me fall to my knees. But he was wrong. I walked toward the exit without saying a word, and that was when he threw that old suitcase I mentioned before. It was filled with my old work clothes, stained with oil. He shouted that it was the only thing that truly belonged to me, because everything else had been paid for by him. Get out and don't come crawling back when you realize the world gives nothing to people who only know how to read. He spat onto the floor near my feet. That night I slept at the bus station. The rain hammered against the metal roof, and the cold crept into my bones, but my mind had never been clearer. I didn't feel sadness, I felt absolute clarity. My father had expelled me not because of my choice, but because of his fear that I might become greater than him. He had taken away my roof, but he had given me the most powerful engine a man can have, the hunger for justice. He believed he was condemning me to misery, but in reality he was freeing me from his suffocating shadow. As I watched the lights of the trucks passing by, I made a silent promise. I wouldn't return to ask him for anything. I would return to buy him. The loss at that moment was total. I lost contact with my mother, whom he forbade from speaking to me under the threat of throwing her out as well. I lost my room, my childhood memories, and the security of a family business that, although toxic, was the only world I knew. I was left alone with a suitcase full of dirty clothes and an envelope containing my university admission. But that symbolic expulsion closed a cycle of mediocrity. By slamming the door in my face, he broke the chains that tied me to his mediocrity. My anger wasn't explosive. It wasn't a fire that burns fast. It was ice that burns slowly and with precision. He stayed on his throne of rusted iron, believing himself victorious, unaware that he had just created his worst enemy. The war would not be won in the workshop, but in law offices and at design tables where intellect is worth more than brute strength. My father threw me out of the house believing I was nothing, and that was his first and last great strategic mistake. 15 years passed before I heard my father's name spoken with any relevance again. In that time, my life became a sequence of cold calculations and sleepless nights. I graduated with honors, not out of pride, but out of necessity. I worked 3 jobs at the same time to pay every university credit, sleeping on couches and eating the bare minimum, while my mind designed the map of my rise. I specialized in process engineering and industrial crisis management. I learned how large corporations devour small family businesses that refuse to evolve. My father remained in his factory, stuck in the 80s, trusting aging contacts and machinery that was begging to be scrapped. Meanwhile, I was building a network of contacts in the financial and technology sectors that he couldn't even imagine. My reconstruction plan didn't begin with an attack, but with patient observation. I became a senior consultant for an investment fund specializing in hostile acquisitions. My job was to identify companies with valuable assets but mediocre and outdated management. My father's factory was the textbook example. For a decade, I gathered information. I knew how much he owed the banks, I knew about his workplace safety problems, and above all, I knew his pride would never allow him to ask for professional help. He still believed the world ran on handshakes and foremans shouting. I knew the modern world runs on termination clauses and variable interest rates. I introduced my strategic ally onto the board, a corporate lawyer named Ethan, a man who shared my view that justice is simply a matter of well-written contracts. Together, we began quietly buying the debts of my father's suppliers through shell companies. I didn't want him to know it was me tightening the rope. I wanted him to feel the suffocation of the market without understanding where the blow was coming from. My revenge was rational, meticulous. Every time he lost an important contract to a modern logistics company, I was behind that company, advising them on how to offer prices my father could never match with his 30-year-old technology. Patience is a virtue he never had, and that was his downfall. While he panicked and shouted at his employees searching for someone to blame, I studied the public records of his property. I discovered that, to survive a rough period 5 years earlier, he had used the factory land as collateral for a private loan with predatory interest rates. That loan had changed hands several times until it ended up in a portfolio of toxic assets that my investment fund was about to acquire. That was the moment of truth. I had control over his roof, his machines, and his legacy. But I wasn't going to appear yet. A good strategist waits until the enemy exhausts all his ammunition before stepping onto the battlefield. My preparation wasn't only financial but psychological. I made sure every escape route for him was blocked. I spoke with old suppliers he had humiliated for decades, offering them better deals if they stopped providing him with raw materials. It was surprisingly easy. No one liked my father. They only feared him or tolerated him because they had no other option. I slowly removed his commercial oxygen so gradually that he thought it was just bad luck, a bad streak in the economy. But the economy has no feelings. I did, although they were buried under a layer of industrial ice. My intelligence, the same one he once called paper intelligence, was now dictating the rhythm of his heartbeat every time he received a foreclosure notice. I remember the afternoon when Ethan handed me the final document. The foreclosure order was ready. The factory, the family house, and even the old pickup truck he loved to brag about were now under the legal control of my firm. I looked at myself in the mirror that day. I was no longer the boy with the suitcase full of dirty clothes. I was a businessman in his 40s, wearing a tailored suit and carrying the gaze of someone who had seen the bottom of the abyss and decided to build a skyscraper on top of it. I didn't feel euphoria. I felt the technical satisfaction of an engineer watching a piece finally fit perfectly into place after years of design. The final step in my reconstruction was acquiring the small consulting firm that audited his accounts. I wanted to see his real numbers. I wanted to see how much every lost dollar hurt him. I discovered he was in absolute bankruptcy, trying to pay that week's salaries by selling scrap metal from the back warehouse. It was time. Not out of hatred, but because of a poetic justice he himself had planted 20 years earlier when he threw me into the mud. Patience had given me the crown, and cold precision would give me the throne. My father always said men were forged in the factory. I was about to prove that empires are destroyed in the silence of an air-conditioned office. The morning that marked the end of his era was unusually silent. I arrived at the factory at 10 in the morning, in a black sedan that contrasted with the rusted gates that had once been my prison. There were no shouts, no sirens, only the sound of my leather shoes striking the cracked pavement of the yard. The employees, some with faces I recognized despite the passing decades, stopped what they were doing. They saw a man in a suit, escorted by 2 lawyers and a court receiver. They didn't see the boy who had left with a suitcase full of dirty clothes. They saw the man who now owned their future. I walked into the office without knocking. My father was there, hunched over his desk, holding a phone that seemed to weigh a ton in his hand. He looked small. The man who once seemed like an iron giant to me was now an old man with greyish skin and bloodshot eyes. When he saw me, it took him a few seconds to process who I was. When he finally did, he tried to recover his old mask of authority. He stood up, slammed his hand on the desk, and opened his mouth to unleash one of those insults that used to make me tremble. But nothing came out. My presence, cold and absolute, stole the air from his lungs. "What are you doing here?" he finally managed to say. His voice cracked as he tried to sound tough. "I told you not to come back unless it was to apologize." I didn't smile. I felt no need for theatrical satisfaction. I placed the black leather folder on his desk, right on top of his overdue bills. With a small gesture, I signaled Ethan to proceed. My lawyer, with robotic efficiency, began reading the terms of the foreclosure. He explained that the debt had been consolidated by my firm, that the grace period had ended months ago, and that from that moment forward, my father no longer had legal authority over the property, the machinery, or the brand. My father stared at the papers as if they were hieroglyphs. He looked at me, then at the documents, and finally at the window facing the workshop where he had humiliated me in front of everyone. The silence in the office was sepulchral. I could hear the ticking of the wall clock, the same one he used to time my breaks when I was an apprentice. Now that time belonged to my company.
"This is a mistake," he muttered, losing the color in his face.
"The bank promised me an extension. You can't take this from me, Michael. It's your grandfather's blood. It's my life." "I'm not taking it from you," I said in a voice so flat it sounded almost recorded. "Your inability to understand that the world changed while you kept shouting at metal took it from you. I only bought the remains of what you destroyed yourself with your arrogance."
He tried to appeal to blood, to the bond he himself had cut with an axe 20 years earlier.
He started talking about family, about how a son doesn't do this to his father. I looked straight at him without blinking. I reminded him with surgical detail of that afternoon in the rain. I reminded him of the old suitcase, the insults in front of his workers, and how he called me a parasite for wanting to use my brain instead of my muscles. I reminded him that he gave me permission to leave and never come back, and that I simply followed his instructions to the letter. I left, built my own fortune, and returned only when I no longer had to ask him for anything.
The climax wasn't a fight.
It was a capitulation. I watched his shoulders collapse, watched his spirit deflate in the face of legal reality. The court receiver informed him that he had 2 hours to remove his personal belongings from the office. Nothing from the machinery, nothing from the files, nothing that belonged to the plant's operation. The man who believed himself the king of the local industry was being evicted like a delinquent tenant from his own castle. I walked into the workshop and asked the workers to gather, just as he had done that day years before. But this time, the tone was different. I informed them that the factory would close for renovations for 3 months, that everyone would receive a retention bonus, and that when it reopened, it would become a high-precision design and assembly center. The era of the hammer and brute sweat was over. The era of engineering had begun.
I saw my father leave the office for the last time. He carried a small cardboard box with a few photos and a bronze ashtray. He walked with difficulty, dragging his feet through the same mud he once forced me to walk through. He didn't say goodbye to anyone. No one stepped forward to shake his hand. The fear he had planted for years had turned into complete indifference now that he had no power. He stopped for a moment in front of his pickup truck, already marked for towing, and looked at me from a distance. Perhaps he expected a moment of weakness from me, a sign of regret, or an invitation to dinner to fix things. I gave him nothing. I stood at the factory entrance with my arms crossed, watching as he climbed into a taxi he had to pay for himself. The irony was perfect. The man who despised books was being defeated by a system of laws and finance he never bothered to understand. He believed strength was the ultimate power, but today he learned that knowledge is the weapon that truly cuts steel. The factory was no longer his legacy was dead, and his son, the one he once called nothing, was now the owner of his past, his present, and his future. Today, the old factory structure has a facade of glass and reinforced steel. The deafening noise of the presses has been replaced by the subtle hum of robotic arms and the precision of automated systems. My father now lives in a small apartment on the outskirts of town, paid for by an assistance fund he believes comes from the government, but that in reality comes from one of my secondary accounts. I don't do it out of love, not even out of pity. I do it because it is the ultimate way to show him who won. He depends on the silent generosity of the son he once tried to destroy, and that is a weight that consumes him more than any poverty ever could. We never spoke again. I know through others that he spends his afternoons sitting in a park, telling stories about when he was the owner of an empire. Stories no one believes anymore because now he is nothing more than a bitter old man with empty hands. My mother tried to find me, but the damage had already been done. The emotional neutrality I had to build in order to survive her abandonment doesn't allow me to feel the warmth that others call family. For me, family became a technical concept that stopped working a long time ago. Many people look for a moment of forgiveness in stories like this, a hug under the rain or a last-minute redemption. But real life isn't a Sunday movie. In the world of business and of determined men, actions carry permanent consequences. He chose his pride over his son, and I chose my future over his past. The cost of my success was the total loss of my roots. But when the roots are rotten, the best thing to do is cut them and build on solid concrete.
I regret nothing. Every time I sign a contract or see my name attached to an engineering project, I remember the weight of that old suitcase and the cold rain running down my back. That was the fuel that brought me here. My father wanted me to be a laborer in his life, and I ended up becoming the architect of his downfall. There is no hatred in my heart, only a cold, mathematical satisfaction. The balance has been restored. Sometimes, the best revenge is not revenge at all. It is watching life collect its debts and sitting back as time places everyone exactly where they earned the right to be. I am in my office, looking toward the future. He is stuck in the past, trying to understand the moment he lost control. The answer is simple. He lost it the day he believed he could crush a man's mind simply because that man had clean hands. If this story felt as intense to you as it was for me to live it, leave your like and tell me in the comments what you would have done. And if you're not subscribed yet, activate the bell so you don't miss the next stories.